Throughout history, wars have often lasted for years, sometimes even decades. Entire generations have lived and died, while conflicts dragged on between powerful nations. But not every war followed that pattern. In fact, one of the strangest wars in history lasted less than an hour. Yes, you heard that correctly. In 1896, two forces went to war, and the entire conflict was over in just 38 minutes. This bizarre event would later become known as the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war ever recorded. But how does an entire war end in less time than a typical lunch break? To understand what happened, we first need to travel to East Africa in the late 19th century. At that time, the small island nation of Zanzibar was an important trading hub along the East African coast. For centuries, the island had been ruled by powerful sultans who controlled trade routes connecting Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Spices, ivory, and other valuable goods passed through Zanzibar's busy ports. But by the late 1800s, European powers were rapidly expanding their influence across Africa in a period historians now call the Scramble for Africa. Britain and Germany were both competing for control over territories in East Africa. Eventually, Britain gained strong political influence over Zanzibar, turning the island into something similar to a protectorate. The Sultan still ruled, but British officials held enormous power behind the scenes. For a while, this uneasy balance worked, but everything changed in August of 1896. On August 25th, the ruler of Zanzibar, Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, suddenly died. His death created a political crisis almost immediately. According to agreements between Zanzibar and Britain, the next sultan had to receive approval from the British government before taking power. But one ambitious prince decided to ignore that rule completely. His name was Khalid bin Bargash. Within hours of the previous sultan's death, Khalid declared himself the new ruler of Zanzibar and moved into the royal palace. The problem was that the British strongly opposed him. Instead, they supported another candidate for the throne. British officials quickly sent a message demanding that Khalid step down. But Khalid refused. Confident in his position, he gathered soldiers, armed civilians, and palace guards around the royal compound. By the time British authorities realized the situation was escalating, Khalid had assembled roughly 2,800 men to defend the palace. Cannons were positioned, barricades were built, and the palace courtyard was filled with armed defenders. But Khalid had made a fatal miscalculation. While his forces looked impressive on paper, they were no match for the military power Britain was about to bring against him. Just outside Zanzibar's harbor, several British warships were already waiting. These included heavily armed vessels such as HMS St. George, which carried powerful naval artillery capable of destroying buildings in seconds. British officials issued a final ultimatum. Khalid had until 9 o'clock in the morning on August 27th to leave the palace and surrender. If he refused, the British fleet would open fire. Inside the palace, Khalid remained defiant. He believed the British would never actually attack. After all, destroying the palace of a foreign ruler would cause international outrage. Surely the British were bluffing. But when the deadline arrived at exactly 9 a.m., Khalid was still inside the palace. The ultimatum had been ignored, and the British Navy did exactly what they had promised. At 9:02 a.m., the war began. British warships opened fire on the palace with devastating force. Shells slammed into the wooden structure, sending debris flying across the courtyard. Within minutes, fires began spreading through the building. Khalid's forces attempted to fight back with their own artillery, but their weapons were outdated and poorly positioned. Most of their shots missed the British ships entirely. Meanwhile, British naval guns continued bombarding the palace with relentless accuracy. One of Zanzibar's main defensive weapons, an old royal yacht that had been converted into a warship, was quickly destroyed and sunk in the harbor. The palace itself was being torn apart by the bombardment. Walls collapsed, fires raged across the structure, and soldiers defending the compound began fleeing as the situation became hopeless. Then, just 38 minutes after the first shots were fired, the conflict ended. At 9:40 a.m., the palace flag was finally lowered. The war was over. The Anglo-Zanzibar War had officially lasted less than a single hour. The destruction, however, had been devastating. Hundreds of Khalid's supporters were killed or wounded during the bombardment. In contrast, the British forces suffered almost no casualties at all. But perhaps the most surprising part of the story was what happened to Khalid himself. Despite the chaos and destruction, he managed to escape from the palace shortly after the attack began. Khalid fled to the nearby German consulate, where he was granted asylum. Because the consulate was technically German territory, British soldiers could not arrest him without risking an international incident. Eventually, Khalid was secretly transported out of Zanzibar by German officials. With the rebellion crushed and the palace destroyed, Britain quickly installed their preferred candidate as the new ruler of Zanzibar. The island would remain under British influence for decades afterward. And the strange conflict that had taken place that morning would go down in history as the shortest war ever fought. But the Anglo-Zanzibar War also revealed something important about the balance of power during the colonial era. It demonstrated just how overwhelming European military technology had become compared to smaller nations around the world. What might have seemed like a dramatic standoff between two governments had, in reality, been a one-sided confrontation. A war that lasted less than an hour. Yet, despite its short duration, the story remains one of the most unusual events in military history, because wars are usually remembered for their length, their destruction, or the massive battles that define them. But sometimes, history remembers a war for the exact opposite reason, not because it lasted too long, but because it ended almost before it even began. And more than a century later, the Anglo-Zanzibar War still holds its strange place in the record books as the shortest war the world has ever seen.